Thank you to Final Girls for having me. This is wonderful. So I am an author and a film critic, and this is the first time I get to talk about my forthcoming book. So this is very exciting for me. The book comes out in July. So it's just this talk is just going to be a broad overview of my research. So if anything stands out to you during the Q&A, I'm just going to do some history, a little bit of theory, and some case studies. But anything that jumps out, please bring it up, and I'd be happy to chat about it more. But I wanted to start us off with a couple of quick questions. Also, if you can't hear me in the back, just let me know and I'll holler. Is it going to let me? It's not letting me move my slides. So that's not ideal as a starting off point. Let's see. Well, that's a tragic way to move a slide around. Spoilers for the next one, I guess, but... So if I asked you guys in this room right now whether the witch was a feminist symbol, show of hands, who would already say yes? Yeah, okay. Related question. How many of you either do tarot or have an astrology app on your phone? Show of hands. Yeah, okay, great. So these are related questions. These phenomena are related, and they're very much of our time. We've been in kind of a witch vogue for the past decade or so. There was a Pew study in 2014, sorry, just trying to figure out where the hell my mouse is, in 2014 that showed that the number of neo-pagans, Wiccans, and other such groups in America had increased radically since the last study the decade before. And that has only increased. There was another recent study that showed that that number is still going up a little bit. So my research is about the way that these cultural phenomena, neo-paganism, witchcraft, feminism, all come together in the films, in horror films about witches, right? So I'm going to be talking about the cyclical way these phenomena overlap and how these movies kind of express anxieties from a hegemonic perspective about these trends. So the renewed interest in New Age spirituality from an American perspective, this book is from an American perspective. It's about American feminist movements and American political history. So this trend came about during the height of the Me Too movement and the anti-Trump protest movement. So as responses to these two questions indicate, these things inflect each other, and we're going to be looking at that history. So going back to this sad mode of moving my slides around. Excellent. Okay, so imagistically, feminist movements beginning as early as the 19th century used witches in this way. Victorian feminists, first wave feminists, used this symbol to represent suffrage, to protest the way women were represented as hysterical, even as spiritualism was very much in vogue. So a lot of these prominent feminists practice spiritualism or a different form of paganism that Aleister Crowley was a proponent of. So this interplay has been going on forever. Sincere apologies for my mouse. So the question becomes, what makes these things such a good fit for each other? And we're going to talk a little bit about the history before we jump into the movies. Okay. So first I want to say we're talking about the witch in an American context. So even though most cultures have their own kinds of witchcraft, right? Like a lot of Asian witches are represented as more ghostly. A lot of European, like Eastern European witches are presented as more vampiric. But in an American context, it's taken from a kind of polyglot Western European context. We borrow from you guys here. We borrow from France. We borrow from England. And with that in mind, most of the witches in this presentation are white women, and that is really interesting and says a lot. There are some examples in the book where that's not the case, and if you want to talk about that more during the Q&A, that works. That's great. But it's a particular set of fears around white women's femininity within a particular cultural context borrowed from Europe and then taken through Puritanism in the United States. I also want to note that it's drawn from a medieval context, so there's a deeply bioessentialist thing going on throughout, and I will be noting when I'm using femininity and female together separately and what that means. But in terms of the history, all I want to go into today is that the history is less important than the knowledge that the witch is a historical figure. Unlike a lot of horror monsters, this character is drawn from a very real history of systemic femicide, and that inflects the way we think about her. So as historian Karen Carlson says, women who were marked as witches historically were mostly rowdy women who stood out. The witch was a scapegoated woman punished for crimes against what we can now understand as heteropatriarchal authority, right? And it's not just old women. We have that stereotype of the woman with the broom and the hat and the wart, right? But it was women who were too old or too young or too sexy or not sexy enough or mentally ill or outspoken. A lot of those women who were persecuted as witches wanted more authority in the church. And they had their property taken away because what they were doing was not comfortable for the people in charge. So we've been playing out this narrative of persecution since the dawn of cinema as a medium and turning that fictive character based on very real women into a boogeyman. And that says a lot too. Okay, so let's dig into the movies. I want to start us off with a clip. I guess I have to click it. Hello? Maybe not. Oh well, that's all right.
Wait, are you in present mode?
I was. I'm in slideshow. I know. Presenter view. No. Slideshow. Oh, amazing. Okay. So basically, it's a minute-long clip. This is a Georges Méliès film. Here we see the devil, who's in the background, introducing a beautiful young lady to this dumb man who came to his house, and now she's a crone. And that dichotomy is really important to this character. Now, she's a bunch of crones, right? So very scary for this man. He doesn't know what to do. They're having a fabulous time. Another guy comes. What's going on? Here they are. Panicking. The devil's also having a great time in the background. So they cavort a little bit. They play. They disappear. He doesn't know what's going on. But the devil comes back. Very scary for this man. Until, and here we have it, an order is restored. Will you let me move my cursor now? Yes, yes, okay, fabulous. So let's dig into the movies a little bit more. So The Witch, unlike vampire films or werewolf films or zombie films, doesn't have a rigid set of generic tropes to these movies. These movies can look like almost anything as long as there's a scary woman at the heart of the thing. So it can be the Blair Witch Project, it can be Rosemary's Baby, it can be Elvira, it can look like Hermione Granger and Harry Potter, and that's very useful for my purposes because that means that the anxieties of the moment can be soaked up and reflected not only in the archetype, but in the narrative construction and how that archetype is being framed politically. On top of that, as Barbara Creed points out in her book, The Monstrous Feminine, the witch is the only predominantly female horror monster. Okay, so all of these things come together one final time on finding my mouse. There we are. Okay, so all of these things come together to make a fabulous coalescence of different women, but they all have a lot in common nevertheless. So getting into a little bit of the thematic underpinnings that connect these women. So medieval understandings of femininity hinged on an assortment of traits that all fall into the rubric of what Julia Kristeva calls the abject, which is a kind of psychic and bodily excess that she calls archaic, ambiguous, and pre-symbolic. She associates it with menstruation and birth and bodily excretion, all of these natural yet to be pathologized forms of consciousness outside of a man's control. So the witch is a boogeyman here frames femaleness and by extension femininity within this frame as dangerously ambiguous and powerfully hypersexual. So witch hunting texts distributed by the church press these traits as well, which leads to a whole bunch of scholars to suggest that she's a regulatory archetype used to demonize feminine sexuality, representing everything a Christian woman shouldn't be. Thus, the witch in all of these contexts can be viewed as an amalgam figure of the Christian anxiety surrounding the allure of paganism, a religion or religions that celebrate female sexuality and give it a role in religious practice, as well as a threat of feminine religious and sexual power in that context. So that leads to the association between the feminine and the abject. Women in the Christian context were expected to internalize this self-hatred and regulate their own relationship to the abject, using the witch figure as a point of violent, direct comparison at the time. And that goes through the Victorian period, and I'm arguing forever. So a lot of the things that these kinds of characters do, right, are things that women shouldn't do. they're antithetical to femininity. It's like they cause miscarriages, they cause the crops to fail, they seduce men out of wedlock, because that's their fault. And all of that brings us to an idea known as the paradox of womanhood, right? It's the understanding that female is abject, but feminine is pure. And so these characters are a way of expressing that anxiety. They are also associated with altered states of consciousness, and that becomes salient as we get into different decades. But where are we? Yes, so that cyclical thing I was talking about in terms of the way the politics and the movies overlap has been explored in a different context with different female characters by a scholar named Karen Hollinger. So Karen Hollinger has a wonderful essay comparing two different versions of the same story, Cat People. That one's from 1942, and this one is from 1982. In 1942, at the height of the kind of Rosie the Riveter style women in the workforce era in America, this character is very powerful. She's very threatening. She is from a ambiguous Eastern European clan that turns into jaguars when anyone wants to have sex with them. So she's great. She's very scary to the men around her who still want to have sex with her. And say what you will, and that's part of the tension, right? Like, she's still sexy, and that's very scary. But so she gets to cavort like those witches in the first film and have a fabulous time, at least until she's murdered violently at the end. However, in 1982, in the Paul Schrader remake, this lovely character, very sexy, not threatening. She has a brother who does all of the murdering. He dominates her sexually in an incestuous relationship, and she kills chickens in a couple of scenes, but that's kind of all she does, right? So in Hollinger's words, the patriarchal assumption of women's internalization of its cultural standards and codes, so that paradox of womanhood I was talking about, could no longer be confidently entertained after the second wave women's movement. Okay, so cinema history more broadly, now that we have that in mind. Oh, other thing to note, little sidebar, these characters are witches. Karen Hollinger does not talk about that, but it's noted in both films that the clan they come from made a deal with the devil, and that's why they have the power to transform. Anyway, in terms of cinema history, the witch as such rarely appeared in horror films for the first couple of decades of feature filmmaking. During that period of first-wave feminist activism I mentioned earlier in the 20s, one horror-tinged documentary out of Denmark, Benjamin Christensen's Haxan, highlighted the relationship between witchcraft accusations and hysteria in a really fabulous way. It was a feminist political documentary inspired by his historical research into these dynamics. It was so violent and upsetting that it was actually banned in the United States for a very long time, but it does come back into our story a little bit later in a way that speaks to a lot of what I'm talking about. There are some other examples of witches from other genres that I would be remiss to ignore. So the elephant in the room is, of course, The Wizard of Oz, one of the most American films of all time. So that beautiful woman over there is what the Wicked Witch of the West was supposed to look like. She's kind of a femme fatale figure. She's got this very noir makeup. She's got this gorgeous sparkly outfit. She's very sexy. She's very scary. She was played by a silent screen goddess. And then Melvin Leroy, the producer, was like, kids won't be afraid unless she's ugly, right? So we switched her to this more familiar character we have now. We sexed her down. But that dynamic there, that push and pull between the crone and the sexy witch, says a lot about how fundamentally underneath the witch is a sexual threat that we're sublimating into this other archetype. Okay, so in 1942, a rom-com kind of narrativizes the way the paradox of womanhood is internalized in these characters. This fabulous girl is named Jennifer, and she is a witch who comes to the present in Massachusetts to torture and punish the ancestors of the people who burned her at the stake. Unfortunately for Jennifer, her spell backfires, and she falls in love with him instead. So the rest of the film is kind of a really sad, for me, and I'm sure for a lot of people, kind of sad descent into a rom-com where all she wants to do is get married and have his babies, and the ending is this kind of grim presentation of her and her two children. She didn't want to have kids for fear that her female spawn would have the same evil powers she does. And so it's this crazy scene where she's sitting there and her adorable little kids are playing with a broom and she's chastising them, which kind of presages another generation of repressed women whose powers are being sublimated by a kind of heteropatriarchal frame. She was also, they promoted this movie through sexy pinups of Veronica Lake in a hat with a broom. Okay, so Our story really starts here in 1958, though. So we're going to spend some time right now talking about the long 60s, which is a historical period that starts in 1959, goes through to 1973. And this is a period in American history that just so much was taking place. It showed a stratospheric rise for the counterculture, the witch films of the counterculture, something called the Nouveau Witch. And we can identify this trend with this wonderful rom-com, Bell, Book, and Candle, which, like I Married a Witch, I've been calling like the best evil goth to prep makeover of all time. She starts out looking like this. She is represented as a beatnik character. So here you see some actual beatniks, and here you see what she's doing. Her name is Jillian. And she's barefoot all the time. She wears little turtlenecks. She goes to the Zodiac Club. Her brother plays the bongos, and she's great. It's based on a play from 1950 where none of that is the case. What happened in between is the beatnik movement began. So Allen Ginsberg released Howl a year before this came out, which is, a gay sex and ayahuasca-fueled fabulous poem that spawned a giant obscenity trial that changed the way we understood obscenity in America and really loosened things up. You have the introduction of jazz. You have On the Road. You have Ken Kesey, who was a who was a writer who then experimented with LSD and created this band of artists called the Merry Pranksters. So yeah, Jillian ends up, by the end of this film, looking like this and apologizing desperately to her befuddled lover, Jimmy Stewart, for ever having tried to cast a spell on him in the first place. And eventually she cries, which is something witches can't do, and the ultimate symbol of her kind of return to appropriate femininity. So you see here that even though the aesthetics have caught up with the times, the politics have not yet. So this is 1958. Another thing to note about the 1960s is it was a terrible time for the movie business. It was just a horrible, horrible time for the movie business. Box office returns were plummeting. Studios kept releasing garbage like Paint Your Wagon that no one wanted to see. And part of the problem here was television, the suburbanization of America. People with families were less likely to go to the movies, which means that the demography of who was going to the movies changed radically. So by 1972, almost 80% of people with some college education claimed to frequently go to the movies, and people under 30 accounted for 73% of the box office, which means that studios, desperately trying to recoup and survive in this marketplace, meant they were importing foreign films like Blow Up. The Hays Code was dying a slow and painful death, which means you have a lot more sexuality in the film business. And on top of that, you have the introduction of low-budget exploitation studios like American International Pictures that were releasing low-budget, what was called cheapies, where basically they would pick a trend and capitalize it as fast as possible. So the witch films of this era came out of this atmosphere of crisis and came out of AIP specifically. So in 1960, AIP imported the classic Giallo film Black Sunday, Mario Bava's first film. The witch is an openly sexual creature played by Barbara Steele. This film is also marked by what one critic noted was a curious internationalism, which becomes important in the context of New Hollywood and also the witch in general. So this is a film based off of a story by a Russian author with an English cast in Italian that was dubbed and imported. So lots of stuff going on here, much like with witch lore. You may be wondering who this woman up here is. That's the Wasp Woman. And she's here for contrast because Barbara Steele, the thing that makes her a notable witch character is that she's doubled. That is her ancestor, she's the ancestor of this other woman who's a chaste and beautiful young virgin with a great boyfriend who she loves, and she's pure and she's wonderful. But the witch, also played by Barbara Steele, replaces her. She's decided to steal her life force and her life, right? So there's this dangerous ambiguity to this character that really comes to the fore in this film in a way that's really important to how this character progresses. She, at one great moment, reveals, she opens her shirt and you think you're going to see her breasts, but it's early enough in the era that that's not possible, so it's a play on that where it reveals her ribs, right? So she kind of embodies all of these abject fears. This is a great Margaret Mead quote. She wrote a lot about witches, and she's talking about how every man fears that under the beautiful woman in his arms, there's something else lurking and he'll never know, right? So that's what this is about. The difference here is, so in the 50s, women, horror monsters, that used to be a beautiful woman, but when she's a monster, she's a wasp. These women, gorgeous, Aliens, it takes place on the moon. There are no other female characters, right? So it's easy to distinguish. Here, not so much. Okay, so let's talk about the occult revival. This was a period in the 60s where basically after the witchcraft laws were repealed, anti-witchcraft laws were repealed in England in the 50s, a lot of people started practicing Wicca in a renewed way. So you have Gardnerian Wicca imported from England. Anton LaVey over there in the corner starts the Church of Satan in 1966. The mainstream gets really nervous. They're seeing a decline in religiosity. So you have this explosion of like self-help books for women who want to improve their circumstances through magic. You know, you have very scared articles in Time all the time, trying to both capitalize and kind of distance. You have Playboy kind of smut articles that take the history I've been talking about and then give you breathless accounts of women being burned at the stake, and they're having a lot of fun with that. So this is the context in which witches really start to take off in the movies. In Black Sunday, Barbara Steele's witch character does die, right? So we're still not there yet. But in 1968, you have Rosemary's Baby. And Rosemary's Baby does a lot of work for the witch film in general. Rosemary's Baby, in case you don't know, she gets impregnated by the devil, she gets gaslit by every single person in her life, and eventually she decides to keep it. That's a huge difference. She does not, the witches are not defeated, the witches essentially take over. She's not particularly happy about it. That last shot is very ambiguous, but that shift speaks to what was happening here, right? Now, why was that happening in Rosemary's Baby? Well, a lot of stuff was going on in the feminist movement that related to witchcraft. Neo-paganism was something that was appropriated by American feminist movements, like WITCH, which was an acronym that they often used to mean Women's International Terrorist Conspiracy from Hell, right? They're fabulous. They went to all of their protests dressed like this. They staged hexings and, you know, all that sort of stuff outside of men's clubs, like throwing flyers and, you know. So that's their manifesto. But basically, when Rosemary's Baby was released, abortion, not legal. Marital rape, very much a legal thing to do. You could rape your wife, and there would be no legal recourse. So the archetype of the witch was being appropriated at this moment. All of those fears were channeled into Rosemary's Baby. Ira Levin said as much. But the question becomes, this is a quote from a Deep Purple song from the time. They saw the movie, and their one question was, if everyone else is on birth control, what about Rosemary? What's going on here? So, there were a bunch of movies like this at the time, and I'll rattle off some names, and if you're curious, I can chat about them. You've got Eye of the Devil, Something Weird, Satanist, The Devil's Mask, The Devil's Wedding Night, Mark of the Witch, The Mephisto Waltz, Belladonna of Sadness, and on and on and on. But I'm just going to chat about one particular fabulous film that if you haven't seen it, you should. This is George Romero's Season of the Witch, and it's amazing. It was desperately underseen at the time because it was mismarketed as a porn film. They changed the name to Hungry Wives! ! Yeah, and so nobody saw it. Like people who went to see it as porn were like, oh, what's going on? This isn't porn. But so it follows the story of a middle-aged housewife who takes up witchcraft as a way of escaping the social death of housewifery and being a woman over 50 in a culture that does not count women over 50 as people. So she takes up witchcraft and eventually kills her husband, who is abusive. There's a scene of him slapping her in the face at one point, and it's presented as horrible that she does this. But at the end, she comes out looking better than ever, drinking cocktails with her friends, and when they go like, you look so much better, what happened? She's like, I'm a witch. So it's an evolution from Rosemary's Baby. It's still ambiguous, right? Because the movie is clearly terrified of the fact that she killed her husband. But so as feminism is at its peak, this is the same year that Roe v. Wade was codified and abortion rights were secured for women. This is what's going on. Yes, okay. So at the same time, this cycle, this is kind of the peak and the decline. We had a resurgence of evangelical Christianity in America. A lot of the hippies became really religious, like they did a lot of acid and then found Jesus. So that was happening around this time. So prices were on the rise. Nixon was in office. Watergate had happened. Everyone's exhausted. And It's getting a little grim out there. The ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment, is introduced and then starts to stall. So the next decade is kind of a slow descent into what brings me to part 2 of my book, the Satanic Panic. So in the 1980s, beginning in the mid-late 1970s, actually, there were concerns that Satanism was impacting children's safety. It was a mass cultural freakout. Religious leaders in the tabloid media were telling their audience that Satanists had infiltrated daycares and were sexually abusing children in the millions. If you look at the FBI reports, the numbers are insane. Like, more children abused by pedophiles than got kidnapped in any given year, right? So crazy numbers. They also claimed that horror films, metal music, and games like Dungeons and Dragons were corrupting adolescents, encouraging them to commit suicide, practice witchcraft, and become gay. At the same time, there are far fewer witch films at this point in time. Why is that, right? If we're following my cyclical thesis, if there are such massive anxieties around Satanism at this period, you would expect a lot of movies about Satanists. No. So the short answer there is that the working woman was such a big problem for conservatives at this time that they did the job for them. So this is Fatal Attraction, a movie where a single working woman who's doing great, actually, and has a great apartment and is having a great life, has an affair with a man, and then loses her mind because her biological clock is ticking, and then decides to destroy his life and try to murder his family. So at this point in time, Susan Faludi described what's known as anti-feminist backlash for this era, and basically the Satanic Panic is an extension of this idea that women belong back in the workforce. Feminism has actually hurt women, and we're all so much sadder now because we have to work when before we were having a great time at home. There was something called the marriage crunch, which the biological clock thing, a result of backlash, where they released a fake study in Newsweek saying that you were more likely to die in a terrorist attack than get married over the age of 35. So that's what was going on. And Satanic Panic is a way of blaming working women for the, threats posed to their kids, right? Why aren't you protecting them in the home? If you introduce them to daycare, then, Satanists will be able to harm them, right? So beyond that, the question becomes, where do witches actually appear, right, in the movies? There is an obvious example. Oh, these are the fun ones. This is just sidebar. Happy to talk about any of these. They all failed. They're mostly horror comedies. They're silly, but I love the posters. Anyway, there's one example who was very much not on this board, the Witches of Eastwick. I gotta say, I love the Witches of Eastwick. I am about to roast the Witches of Eastwick, but it's out of love. It's out of love. It's a great movie, and feminists have reclaimed it as a celebration of female solidarity, female friendship. All of this is true. At the same time, it is a product of backlash to the sexual revolution. It was written by John Updike as an explicit rejection of the sexual revolution, and the plot is basically that these 3 older women wish for a man because they're so lonely, because they're being career women and seemed fine again, actually, but whatever. So they conjure up the devil by mistake. He seduces all 3 of them, using a lot of the rhetoric that was being used by groups like WITCH in the 60s, right? He talks about how witches are a persecuted symbol of, female sexual empowerment. He only says that to sleep with them. They only have power through him. And in the end, they decide to stay out of the workforce, keep their babies in their very nice home, and lose all of their powers after they excise Daryl from their lives, right? It's presented as kind of a mistake and a dalliance. And the moral center of this film is a character who's basically a stand-in for the Satanic Panic. She spends a lot of time making, kind of laughable claims about how the witches being slutty in public causes sodomy in children or whatever. But in the end, they kill her by accident, and things are it's gone too far, right? There's a line where she says, I have nothing against a good fuck, but we have to take things seriously. So, they're having their cake and eating it too, in the 80s. How am I doing on time? Let's find out. I'm doing great. Okay. So, we're going to move on a little bit into the 80s, or into the 90s. So, the 90s are known for the third wave feminist movement. It's a great time for feminism in a lot of ways, but at the same time, I'm going to crib a Karina Longworth line from her fabulous You Must Remember This podcast. She talks about how The backlash of the 80s by 1992 was the meat of the culture. It was mainstreamed, right? So we were actually increasing as a country. There was a rise in evangelical politics. They had like fully brought themselves into the mainstream. Pat Buchanan introduced the idea of a culture war in 1992. On top of that, in various state governments, there were anti-witchcraft laws proposed, like in state constitutions. So the 90s are a weird and rough time, kind of continuing the backlash of the 80s. But what happened to bring us here? So for people who do not know, 1992 was the year of the woman in the United States. It was declared the year of the woman because more women ran for office in 1992 than had ever done so before. There were more women in office than ever before for a reason, and that reason was Clarence Thomas. Clarence Thomas is a currently sitting Supreme Court justice. He sexually harassed one of his clerks for years, and when he was nominated to the Supreme Court, she came forward to point out that he is gross, and she was basically ritually humiliated by Congress for days, and it pissed everyone off so much that it inspired two important documents: Becoming the Third Wave by Rebecca Walker and the Riot Grrrl Manifesto by fabulous Kathleen Hanna from Bikini Kill. And both of these things are really important for the same reason. These two women were proposing an intersectional feminism that accounted for class and race as well as gender. It was, anti-fat phobia. It was a much more progressive frame that included women of color, like in the foreground of the movement. At the same time, there was an emphasis on reclaiming slurs against women. So something I should note is George H.W. Bush, during his vice presidential debate with Geraldine Ferraro, had a little slip where he called her a bitch, and everyone freaked out. And his rejoinder was like, no, like I called her a witch, I called her a witch. It's the same thing. It is the same thing. And we're acknowledging that in the 90s, right? So Elizabeth Wurtzel's follow-up to Prozac Nation was bitch in praise of difficult women, and all of these things are angry and fed up, right? Like, what good has being good ever done anyone if Anita Hill has to sit through Orrin Hatch reading The Exorcist at her, which is true. He actually did do that during the hearings, which basically turned into like an insult fest against her. So that's what's going on in the 90s. It's a push and pull. Third wave feminism got very quickly and ironically co-opted into kind of girl power discourse that kind of corporatized and sold this rhetoric through things like the Spice Girls. All love to the Spice Girls. So that's kind of what's going on, is it was turned into a t-shirt. Riot Grrrl was a very short-lived movement because they proposed a media blackout after they were being insulted and objectified, so it very quickly got co-opted into a kind of aestheticized mode. At the same time, you had a resurgence of neo-paganism, a renewed interest in the occult. You had a number of fantastic primers like Teen Witch, Wicca for a New Generation, written by the second wave feminists who were practicing Wicca in the 60s. They managed to incorporate anti-Satanic Panic, like they had to incorporate the Satanic Panic into this because it had only really ended in 1993. A lot of people went to jail. Some of them were released in the 90s. By the way, a lot of the people who went to jail were gay. So that's a sidebar, but we were able to reincorporate the neo-pagan tradition and kind of re-inflect it through Riot Grrrl into this fabulous combination of punk, goth, and new age. I have my absolute favorites, the Hex Girls from Scooby-Doo and the Witch's Ghost up here, and Thorn in the front. When she introduces herself, she's like, we're eco-goths. So eco-goth is kind of the aesthetic we're going for here, but a lot of the witch media actually brought on witch consultants for the practices on display, right? So it's definitely rooted both in the feminism of the 60s and the counterculture and the angry girl feminism of the 90s. Which brings us to our examples from the 1990s. So, again, I love the craft. I love the craft so much. We all defend the craft. We all reclaim the craft. We are about to roast the craft, and that's okay. I have nothing but good things to say about Eve's Bayou and Practical Magic, and if anyone wants to chat about those two movies, they're fantastic. The Craft is basically what happened to third wave feminism. It exemplifies everything bad that happened to third wave feminism and arguably why third wave feminism simply did not succeed. So you have here a representation of collectivist, dynamic, intersectional magic. They only work together when there are all four of them. It's a diverse cast of people with a series of different kinds of problems. She has a disability. Nancy Downs is working class and being sexually abused by her father. And then you have our Black witch here, one of like three in this mainstream representation, right? So that's huge because that hadn't really happened before. At the same time, in the end, these three, I haven't talked about our main character yet. Our main character is upper class, seems to have no real problems that are identifiable in the same way that the others do. It's noted that she was depressed in the past. Okay, so she's kind of fine. She's like fine. And she's the only one who gets to represent good and morality in the film. She actually invokes the biblical golden rule when talking to her coven, which that says a lot, right? So normal morality is like reinstituted, and these three witches are punished for their desire for power and retribution, right? These three kind of serve as the mouthpiece for the kind of feminism that was in vogue at the time, right? So Kathleen Hanna has a line that's like, I used to think I hate men, and I guess I do, right? So these are the bitchy feminists, and this is our good girl who wins out in the end. These three lose their powers, like the Witches of Eastwick, and Nancy Downs gets institutionalized in a kind of parody of hysteria that brings us all the way back to Huxon. So it's a little bit rough, and this dissolution of intersectionality and the foregrounding of kind of white, rich feminism that continued through the 2000s is the real problem on display and presages what we get in the next decade. I'm powering through because I only have so much time. But yes, I was yapping and did not keep track of where I am in my notes. Anywho, here we are. It's the 2000s. I'm not going to talk about the 2000s for that long, but here's a mood board. It was a rough time to be an American. It was a jingoistic time in the wake of 9/11. You had this kind of cultural retrenchment known as the vulgar wave, right? You were returning to a school of advertising actually known as the Slutburger, inspired by Paris Hilton and raunchy ads like these. You had this guy just, denigrating the concept of education, instituting a national right to life day, trying to codify against gay marriage in the Constitution. There was a lot going on, and evangelicals were basically most of W's base, right? So they had a huge amount of power in the culture at this point in time, and witches were totally sublimated into the realm of fantasy. So this is the main one. This is mostly what was happening, right? And Hermione Granger is another really good example of what's going on with feminism at the time. Hermione Granger is a girl boss before the girl boss was codified. The girl boss was codified in 2014, so basically after this wave of fantasy films. And she tries harder than everyone else, is better than everyone else, right? She's like a bootstraps kind of success story. She's very much one of the guys. If you look in contrast to characters like Luna Lovegood and Trelawney, who are more traditional witches with a new age sensibility, she's the mouthpiece for denigrating their kind of femininity and their kind of feminism. And even though they, are proven, it's like, oh, they did help, like, oh, cool. She's the pinnacle of what being a correct woman should be. And that speaks to what's going on in the culture, right? It's like this proto-lean-in feminism. Even then, even at its most harmless, there is no reference to Satanism, any kind of historicized witchcraft in this whole series. The books were routinely burned by evangelicals at the time for being, a positive portrayal of Satanism. So it was a really, really rough time to be pagan. It was a really rough time to be a woman, and we're fully in the post-feminist era, right, which is kind of an evolution of the girl power thing that's right before the girl boss thing, where celebrities of all stripes were disavowing any relationship to feminism. Demi Moore, who just starred in The Substance, which is great and all about feminism, wanted to call herself a humanist. Kelly Clarkson said that she doesn't like the term because it means you're man-hating, and she loves having a man support her, right? So this is what's going on in the culture. That tension inflects everything. anything. So you had to be Hermione to succeed. Okay, so before I move into the next slide, which I know this is the first one that I remembered what's on my slide next. So basically, as the 2000s became the 2010s, that began to shift into, the girl boss mode. President Obama was the first president to say in office that he was a feminist. Emma Watson became the UN ambassador for women and talked about how feminism has become a dirty word and, was trying to lift that back up. So we're seeing a reemergence of feminism within the context of like a very capitalist frame where it was like, we need more women CEOs, we need diversity within a capitalist context. And then this happened. So we don't need to talk about it that much. But, this is basically the violent pushback to even that kind of feminism that we were having with its many, many caveats, right? Like, corporate pride or no, this is what we got, much as the book burnings with Harry Potter were that kind of response, right? So you have the Me Too movement coming up at the same time, and as in the 90s, you had a resurgence of neo-paganism once more. As with 90s, it was like a kind of a 90s nostalgia thing combined with the rage of seeing Trump get elected as, grab him by the pussy, the fact that he's a serial rapist. I can say that, that's true. Anyway, so people brought WITCH back and staged hexings against the likes of Brock Turner and Brett Kavanaugh. So the angry girl feminism was back. This is an op-ed in the New York Times that kind of typifies what was going on here. Yes, this is a witch hunt, and I am hunting you, right? So that's the rage. This became a very familiar trend that we all know. This is, what we've been dealing with for the past long while. A24 brought us a lot of witches. Folk horror is basically just a broader umbrella that encapsulates a lot of witch horror. That kind of ambiguous triumph that you got in the late 60s and early 70s is really brought to fruition in these films. The end of the witch, obviously iconic. The world has been destroyed around her, and she floats up to embrace her coven and her power. At the end of Midsummer, while her boyfriend is burned to death, here she is, smiling, embracing something that is presented as obviously terrifying and bad, but say what you will. Here you have Suspiria, where Susie, as she becomes Mother Suspiria, rips open her chest in this kind of radically transcendent, nihilistic pose. And then here you have a movie that I fight for all the time. People should watch it. It's called Color Out of Space, and I love it. And it's witchcraft by way of psychedelic aliens. It rocks. The same thing is happening here. Yes, Richard Stanley film. Would recommend. So that's what's going on here. I'm running out of time, but the thing that's interesting here is that is the end of the film. There's never an ability to envision a future for feminism, right? It's a kind of Frederick Jameson, like, we don't know how to envision a progressive future. We can only it's harder to envision the death of capitalism than it is to envision the apocalypse, right? So it always ends here, but it feels damn good when it does. So this is kind of the peak of the 2010s horror cycle. What's going on now? It happened again. It really happened again, and that's because Susan Faludi has said that the current era of backlash is significantly worse than the backlash of the 1980s. She says that he is significantly worse than Ronald Reagan for many, many obvious reasons, at least on a personal and now on a political level, and the witch cycle is on the decline. Part of it, as with the 80s, is that we've been so saturated with it that it's become familiar, but we're historicizing witches now. We have Witches, the documentary, which is screening here today, and books like mine, right, talking about exactly what's going on here. And reviews of this film, some of the few negative reviews were basically like, we know, like, this is boring, we get it already, right? So these things are bleeding out into other tropes. You have, once more as in the 2000s, this kind of broad degeneration into children's films, the realm of fantasy films. You see the trope of the, either woman or genderqueer character embracing a sort of radical transcendence here, as with the working women of the 80s, right? It's enough to be a woman or a queer person. We don't need the witch anymore. Like, it just is what it is. So you see those tropes radiating outward in the culture. They're also proposing a sequel to Practical Magic, a remake of Possession, a remake of Witchboard from the 80s. So it's kind of exploding outward, and it's dissolving into kind of hard to parse thing. So it'll reconsolidate at some point, but as we move into this newly scary era, feminists and witches alike will be able to find a voice through these tropes. So, thank you so much.